With a renewed sense of urgency and determination, the search teams returned to the scene, meticulously scouring the surrounding area. Every patch of earth, every rock, every blade of grass was examined with painstaking care. No detail was too small to ignore. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about the location. In fact, it was one of the earliest sites they'd investigated. Everything seemed ordinary, unchanged, familiar. For a brief moment, uncertainty set in. Was it possible they had overlooked something so crucial? Could the evidence have been concealed so expertly that it remained hidden despite multiple thorough searches? But then, as the forensic specialists began to delicately excavate the soil, layer by layer, the chilling truth started to reveal itself. Katie Kenyon was there. For the detectives, this discovery confirmed what they had long feared. This was not the result of a tragic accident or a simple misunderstanding. This was something far more sinister. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Katie Kenyon was born in the peaceful working-class town of Burnley, England, in the year 1983. The quiet streets and close-knit neighborhoods of Burnley shaped her early years, and it was within this environment that she grew up alongside her two sisters, one older and one younger. The bond between the three girls was incredibly strong from the very beginning. They weren't just siblings, they were best friends. Whether they were playing together in the backyard, walking to school side by side, or supporting each other through tough times, their closeness was undeniable and deeply rooted. Even as a child, Katie had a warmth and kindness that stood out. She was the type of person who would always think of others first. If a classmate forgot their lunch, or if someone was sitting alone on the playground, Katie would notice and do something about it. Her generosity didn't fade as she grew older. It only became more apparent. Friends, neighbors, even people she barely knew would often say she had a heart of gold. Her empathy wasn't just something she talked about. It showed up in her actions, time and time again. Later in her life, Katie found herself building a family of her own. She got married and eventually became the mother of two children, a son and a daughter, who quickly became the center of her world. Being a mother meant everything to her. She worked hard to give her children a stable, loving home, even as the relationship with her husband began to strain under the weight of everyday pressures. Eventually, her marriage came to an end. Her husband left the household, though he continued to have some contact with the kids. Now, a single mother, Katie had to juggle parenting with full-time work. She took a job as a social care worker, a role that suited her compassionate nature perfectly. But the work was demanding, both emotionally and financially. Her paycheck barely stretched far enough to cover the necessities, but she never complained. She always found a way to ensure her children had clothes that fit, food on the table, and support with their schoolwork. Despite the struggles, Katie showed strength, resilience, and a quiet kind of courage. On the morning of April 22, 2022, then 33-year-old Katie followed her usual routine. She got up early, helped her kids get ready for school, and sent them off with hugs and packed lunches. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She didn't appear rushed, upset, or distracted. But later that day, things took a sudden and unsettling turn. Just a few hours after the children had left for school, Katie's mother received a text message from her daughter. The message, while not alarming in tone, felt oddly impersonal and out of character. In it, Katie said she needed to take some time away from everything, to clear her head, and that she would be gone for a while. There was no indication of where she was going or for how long, and she didn't offer much reassurance. Her mother's instincts kicked in immediately. Something about the message didn't sit right. She tried calling Katie right away, but the call went straight to voicemail. That's when a deep sense of worry began to take hold. Katie had battled anxiety for many years, brought on by the stress of raising her children alone and other challenges in her personal life. But even during the most difficult times, she had never distanced herself from her children. She never would have willingly left them in uncertainty. Growing more concerned by the minute, her mother reached out to Katie's sisters. All three women were in complete agreement. The message didn't sound like Katie at all. They decided to go straight to her house to check on her. When they arrived, they noticed right away that her car was missing. They used a spare key to let themselves inside, where they found almost everything untouched. Her clothes, makeup, favorite jewelry, and even personal notes were all still there. Only her phone and handbag were gone. It didn't make sense. Katie wasn't the type to leave home on a whim, especially without letting her family know. A short time later, the children returned home from school. That's when even more pieces of the puzzle began to surface. Both kids had received text messages from their mother. The messages stated that she was going away to get help and become a better parent. She also asked them to contact their father so he could care for them while she was gone. But something felt off about these messages too. Her mother and sisters noted immediately that the tone and phrasing didn't match Katie's usual way of writing. More suspiciously, the word while was misspelled in both messages, something that struck them as particularly strange, given how careful Katie was with her writing. She rarely, if ever, made mistakes like that. Then, her son shared a surprising detail. He had been contacted on social media by a man named Andrew, better known to the family as Andrew, Katie's ex-boyfriend. Andrew and Katie had dated on and off for several years in a relationship marked by ups and downs. While the family was aware of him, he hadn't been part of Katie's life recently. According to the message Andrew sent, Katie had voluntarily checked herself into a clinic and had asked him to take care of her dog while she was away. The family found this strange and unsettling. Why would Katie, if she truly needed help and was stepping away, choose to confide in Andrew, an ex-partner with whom she'd had a turbulent relationship, instead of her own family or even the father of her children? What made things even more confusing was that Andrew was mentioned in the messages Katie had supposedly sent to her kids. In them, she said that if their father wasn't available, Andrew would step in and help. Again, this didn't sound like the kind of decision Katie would make lightly or without discussing it with her family. Katie's sister decided to reach out directly. She found Andrew's number and gave him a call. When he answered, he told her that he hadn't seen Katie since the day before. He explained that he'd been at work all morning, but at around 2 p.m., Katie had sent him a text saying she was dropping her car off at his house. According to Andrew, she told him that she was leaving the car keys and her bank card in his mailbox. Andrew added that Katie owed him a substantial amount of money, about £6,000 sterling, for anxiety treatment expenses he had helped cover in the past. He claimed this drop-off was her way of repaying the debt. In a follow-up message, Katie allegedly told him that she was heading back into a clinic because she felt overwhelmed and couldn't cope any longer. Andrew said that nothing about the messages had seemed unusual to him, so he hadn't thought twice about them. But Katie's sister didn't buy his explanation. The entire situation didn't sit right with her. So she and her boyfriend made a decision. They would drive over to Andrew's place and see things for themselves. As Katie's sister and her boyfriend pulled up in front of Andrew's home, an uncomfortable chill ran down her spine. There it was, Katie's car, parked right outside his house. What made the sight more troubling wasn't just the fact that the vehicle was there. It was what she could see inside it. Through the window, clearly visible in the front seat, were Katie's purse and a few other personal belongings. It immediately raised red flags. If Katie had left to seek help, why would she abandon her car with essential items inside, especially her handbag? It just didn't add up. Fueled by growing suspicion, Katie's sister stepped up to the front door and knocked, hoping Andrew would speak to her face-to-face and clear things up. But to her surprise and frustration, Andrew refused to open the door. From behind it, he told them they needed to leave, and he wasn't willing to talk. His refusal only deepened the concern. Why was he being so uncooperative, especially when someone he had known intimately was now missing? Katie's sister couldn't understand his behavior. If he had nothing to hide and truly cared about Katie, shouldn't he be doing everything possible to help find her? Shouldn't he be worried too? But instead of offering assistance, Andrew was acting cold, detached, even irritated. The tension escalated when her boyfriend, already angry and deeply worried, threatened to force the door open if Andrew continued to refuse communication. But instead of engaging, Andrew made a call to the police. Within minutes, officers arrived at the scene. They spoke with Katie's sister first. She laid everything out in detail, trying to remain calm but clearly distraught. She explained that Katie hadn't been heard from since the previous day, and how the entire family was consumed with worry. She told them how completely out of character it was for Katie to disappear without a word, and how suspicious it was that her car and belongings were left at Andrew's residence. She also emphasized that Katie had never mentioned going to a clinic or needing a break, at least not to those closest to her. After listening, the officers turned their attention to Andrew. They knocked on his door, and this time, he answered. He calmly repeated the same story he had told over the phone the day before. He said that Katie had messaged him saying she was dropping off her car, leaving her keys and bank card in his mailbox, and heading off to a mental health clinic to get support for her anxiety. He said it didn't strike him as unusual at the time, and that's why he hadn't raised the alarm. In a surprising move, Andrew even allowed the officers to search his house and his van. The search didn't reveal anything that seemed out of place or suspicious at first glance. No obvious signs of wrongdoing. With no evidence to detain him, the officers couldn't do much more at that point. However, they took the situation seriously enough to formally open a missing persons case. The next logical step for law enforcement was to contact mental health clinics across the region. If Katie really had checked herself in somewhere, someone should have record of it. But as call after call was made, the answer remained the same. No one matching Katie Kenyon's description had been admitted. Every lead turned up empty. The following morning, investigators began constructing a detailed timeline of the hours leading up to Katie's disappearance. With her car found at Andrew's house, his residence became the central point of focus. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood and discovered there was a surveillance camera positioned just down the street. They retrieved the footage from the 2 days prior to her vanishing, hoping it would shed light on what had happened. On April 21st, the day before Katie was officially reported missing, the camera recorded her car pulling into Andrew's driveway. The footage clearly showed Katie stepping out of the vehicle and approaching his front door. Not only that, but the camera captured her smiling and greeting Andrew warmly. She even kissed him before getting into his van. At that moment, there was nothing that looked suspicious. Everything seemed completely normal. If anything, it looked like a friendly or even affectionate visit. But the next morning, April 22nd, told a different story. At precisely 9:20 a.m., surveillance footage showed Katie's car arriving once again at Andrew's house. She got out and climbed into the passenger seat of his van. Behind the wheel was Andrew himself. This moment directly contradicted the story he gave police, that Katie had simply dropped off her car while he was at work. According to the footage, he had been at home, and he had personally picked her up. It was a critical discrepancy. Police then turned to traffic cameras along the road leading away from Andrew's neighborhood. They tracked the route the van had taken and confirmed it made a brief stop at a McDonald's before continuing toward a remote, rural area. Eventually, a final camera captured the van turning onto a secluded back road leading into dense woodland. Then, for nearly an hour, there was nothing. The van vanished from all surveillance. But almost exactly 58 minutes later, the same van was spotted again, returning from the direction of the woods. This time, something was different. There was only one person inside. Katie was no longer in the vehicle. At this point, law enforcement realized the situation was far more serious than a standard missing persons case. The footage painted a deeply troubling picture. Andrew had driven Katie to a remote wooded area and returned alone, despite claiming she had left on her own to seek treatment. Investigators quickly obtained location data from Katie's mobile phone. That data revealed a timeline that closely aligned with the van's movements. Her phone disconnected from the local tower near her home early that morning, then reconnected in the area around Andrew's residence. From there, it followed the same route captured by the cameras. But here's where things took another confusing turn. According to GPS tracking, Katie's phone returned with the van. The device had traveled back along the same route and reappeared near Andrew's house, even though Katie herself was no longer in the vehicle. How could her phone come back without her? Investigators began to suspect it had been deliberately kept to make it seem like Katie was still on the move, even when she wasn't. Then came a critical detail: the messages that were sent from Katie's phone to her children and mother. By analyzing timestamps and cell tower pings, police determined those texts were sent after the van returned from the wooded area. More importantly, location data confirmed they were sent from inside Andrew's home. This contradicted Andrew's version of events in a direct and undeniable way. Katie was supposed to have left earlier that morning, and yet messages were sent from her phone when she was no longer visible and likely no longer nearby. it raised an unavoidable conclusion. Someone else was using her phone. Police returned to Andrew's house with a new level of urgency and purpose. Upon entering, they immediately noticed something strange. The entire house was unusually hot, even though the weather outside was mild and spring-like. They soon discovered the cause. Andrew had lit a wood-burning stove and kept it running at full blaze. For detectives, that small detail set off alarm bells. By the time investigators returned to Andrew's residence and carefully examined the wood-burning stove, it was too late to gather any physical evidence from it. All that remained inside was a mound of gray, powdery ash, soft to the touch, scattered loosely, and giving away no clues. Whatever had been burned was now completely unrecognizable. Whether it was personal items, documents, or something else entirely, detectives could no longer say with certainty. Despite the lack of physical proof, law enforcement decided to move forward. Andrew was placed under arrest and brought in for formal questioning. The circumstances had become far too suspicious to ignore. Surprisingly, Andrew showed almost no signs of panic or distress. In fact, he appeared eerily calm, sitting across the table from detectives, maintaining his composure, and sticking to the same story he had told before. He repeated his claim that Katie had simply chosen to check herself into a clinic for her anxiety. According to him, she had been struggling emotionally, and her sudden disappearance wasn't cause for alarm. It was just her way of coping. But as detectives began to press further, challenging his version of events with the timeline they had built and the surveillance footage they'd uncovered, Andrew abruptly shut down. He refused to answer any more questions and insisted he would not speak further without a lawyer present. The interrogation came to an end, and once again, investigators were left with more suspicions than answers. Still, police were far from giving up. They knew that Katie's phone had last pinged in a densely wooded area not far from Andrew's home, right before his van was seen returning without her. It was the most tangible lead they had, and they had to follow it. The next phase of the investigation launched one of the largest search efforts the region had ever seen. The forest in question stretched across more than 25 miles of rugged natural terrain, an overwhelming area to comb through, especially with limited clues about where to start. But despite the odds, authorities threw every possible resource into the effort. Dozens of officers were called in, and multiple law enforcement agencies joined forces. Search teams deployed drones equipped with thermal imaging, helicopters hovered overhead, and teams of divers were brought in to check nearby bodies of water. Even volunteers from the local community stepped forward. People who had never met Katie but felt a deep desire to help. It was an extraordinary display of unity, but even with all that manpower and technology, the search yielded no immediate results. The sheer size of the forest made progress painfully slow. Then, a sudden break changed everything. A witness came forward with a tip. They claimed to have seen Andrew's van parked in a very specific area of the forest around the time of Katie's disappearance. That single detail allowed police to narrow the scope of their search significantly. What had previously been a massive, wide-ranging operation was now focused on a radius of just 5 meters. As specialized teams returned to the area with renewed urgency, investigators brought Andrew back in for another round of questioning. This time, they confronted him directly with the evidence they had compiled. The footage from the surveillance cameras, the timeline, the phone data, the fact that Katie was seen getting into his van and never seen getting out. Faced with facts he could no longer deny, Andrew shifted his story. He admitted that yes, he and Katie had gone into the woods together that day. But what he said next left detectives confused and, frankly, suspicious. According to Andrew, the outing was entirely innocent. He claimed the two had planned a picnic, a peaceful morning in nature to clear their heads. He said that Katie had a personal habit of writing down her thoughts in a journal, particularly when she felt overwhelmed. Once she had written everything she needed to, she would burn the pages, symbolically letting go of whatever burdens she was carrying. Andrew told detectives that's exactly what happened. They had lunch. She wrote in her journal. Then, they lit a small fire, and she burned a few pages. Afterward, he claimed, he dropped her off and returned home alone. When asked what happened to Katie after that, Andrew said he had no idea. To the investigators, this explanation felt thin, contrived even. Yes, it was technically plausible, but it didn't fit with the rest of the evidence. More importantly, it didn't explain why Katie's phone had followed the van back to his house, or why messages from her device were sent after she was no longer seen. But without concrete physical evidence tying Andrew to a crime, law enforcement couldn't proceed with formal charges just yet. So the investigation pivoted to another angle: Andrew and Katie's relationship history. Investigators hoped that understanding the dynamic between them might shed light on Katie's sudden and suspicious disappearance. Katie had met Andrew about 3 years prior. At first, he had seemed dependable. He worked in construction, had 2 children from a previous marriage, and came across as someone who was grounded and mature. For a while, things between them were steady. But slowly, small concerns started to emerge. Katie's family began to notice changes in her behavior. They also noticed that Andrew had a tendency to be overbearing, sometimes even controlling. He told Katie what to wear, how to speak, and frequently criticized her thoughts or opinions. He often dismissed her feelings by blaming her anxiety, telling her she was overreacting or imagining things. That kind of constant emotional pressure only intensified her struggles. Over time, Andrew offered to help her financially by covering the costs of anxiety treatment, and Katie, desperate for support, accepted. But the relationship continued to deteriorate. The arguments became more frequent, the emotional toll heavier. For her, the breakup felt like an enormous weight had been lifted. She began to reestablish her independence and focus on her kids. But according to those closest to her, Andrew didn't handle the breakup well. In fact, he seemed unable or unwilling to accept it. Shortly after they separated, Katie experienced a disturbing incident. She discovered that all 4 tires on her car had been slashed. She was convinced Andrew had done it, but she never reported it to police. Maybe she thought it wasn't worth the confrontation. Maybe she just wanted to move on. Then came another shock. A few months before she vanished, Katie received a formal letter from the court stating she owed Andrew £4,000, the amount he claimed he had paid toward her mental health treatment. Katie, already struggling financially, was devastated. As a single mother trying to make ends meet, she had no idea how she would repay such a large sum. With legal fees and penalties accumulating, the debt eventually grew to £6,000. The pressure weighed heavily on her. She became overwhelmed with the fear that she might lose her home, the one stable thing she had managed to maintain for her children. But it wasn't just the financial burden that haunted her. She was afraid of Andrew. In private conversations with her family, Katie confided her fears. In one message to her mother, she admitted she felt unsafe. In another conversation with her sister, she made a chilling statement. "If anything ever happens to me, look at Andrew first, even after everything. After the court case, the growing tension, and months of emotional stress, Andrew wasn't done." Just 1 month before Katie disappeared, he reached out again. His tone had completely changed. He expressed regret, saying he wished he had never taken legal action against her. He said he had made a mistake and promised to make things right. In a string of messages, Andrew assured Katie that he was going to drop the case entirely. He even claimed that he would take care of all the additional court fees and penalties that had accrued since the original ruling. Andrew's apology seemed heartfelt on the surface. He acknowledged how angry and controlling he had been and told Katie that he was trying to change. He insisted that he was working on himself and that he still cared about her deeply. Slowly, his words began to have an impact. Despite everything that had happened in their past, Katie wanted to believe him, and in time, she forgave him. But behind the scenes, detectives would later uncover something much darker. Almost immediately after telling Katie he was working to reverse the court ruling, Andrew made a very different kind of phone call, one to the debt collectors. Instead of canceling the process, he told them to increase the pressure. He explicitly asked them to escalate their collection efforts against Katie, urging them to be more aggressive in their pursuit of the money. Investigators would later theorize that this was all part of a calculated effort. Andrew wanted Katie to feel overwhelmed. The more anxious and cornered she became, the more likely she would be to lean on him. Katie, of course, had no idea about this betrayal. She genuinely believed Andrew was trying to make things right. He continued telling her that he was in the process of overturning the court's decision, that it was just taking time due to legal complications. Privately, he was doing the exact opposite. A few weeks later, he contacted the debt collectors again. This time, he told them that Katie had come to his house and attacked him. He insisted they act fast to recover the money and use this alleged altercation to pressure them into taking quicker legal action. When the collectors followed up with Katie, she was blindsided and understandably panicked. She had no idea where this was coming from. She reached out to Andrew immediately, and once again, he told her she was overreacting. He said she was being dramatic, that she was letting her emotions get the best of her. He reassured her that everything was under control and that he was still working on it. From the outside, it was becoming increasingly clear to detectives what was happening. Andrew was playing a dangerous game of psychological manipulation, pushing Katie into a corner emotionally, financially, and mentally, then presenting himself as the only person she could rely on. It painted a deeply troubling portrait of a man who was not just deceitful, but methodical and strategic in his dishonesty. While this disturbing pattern was being pieced together, the physical search for Katie continued. Days passed with no sign of her. Hope was dwindling. Investigators were covering every possible lead, but nothing concrete had turned up. That is, until a local man stepped forward with an unusual encounter. The witness explained that the morning after Katie vanished, Andrew had shown up at his property. The two men didn't know each other personally, but Andrew approached him anyway with a strange question. "Do you know when your bins were last emptied?" The man thought the question was odd, and something about Andrew's demeanor unsettled him. He remembered the interaction, and later, after hearing about the missing persons case, he reported the incident to police. Investigators immediately rushed to the property and examined the garbage bins, which hadn't been collected in several days. What they found inside was chilling. Among the discarded waste, inside one of the black refuse sacks, they found a pair of women's sandals. They were carefully packaged inside the bag, almost as if someone had tried to conceal them. A forensic team was brought in, and within days, DNA testing confirmed what many feared. The sandals belonged to Katie. It was the breakthrough police had been waiting for. Soon after, Andrew was formally charged with Katie's murder. Once in custody, he once again told police he wanted to speak. And just like every time before, his story changed, dramatically. In this new version, Andrew claimed that he and Katie had gone to the forest for a peaceful outing. He repeated the earlier claim about the picnic, but now introduced a startling new detail. He said that while they were sitting by the fire, Katie noticed a small hatchet, one he had brought to chop wood. According to Andrew, she jokingly dared him to throw the hatchet and try to hit a soda can she was holding at a distance. Andrew said he agreed, and in what he described as a freak accident, Katie leaned forward just as he threw the hatchet. Detectives were highly skeptical. The story seemed deliberately crafted to downplay responsibility, painting the situation as an unfortunate accident. But for the first time, Andrew admitted that Katie had died in the woods. He claimed that in the panic and shock of the moment, he didn't know what to do. He said there was no cell phone signal, and he didn't believe he had the physical strength to carry her back to the van. So instead of calling for help, he said he left her where she had fallen. Before walking away, he claimed he tied a plastic bag to a stick and placed it near the site as a makeshift marker, intending to return later. He said he then drove home, destroyed her phone and several of her personal belongings in his fireplace, and disposed of the ashes in a public trash bin. He also admitted to burning items in the wood-burning stove at his house, the same stove investigators had previously found filled with ash. All the while, the search for Katie continued. Now, investigators had a new objective: find the marker Andrew claimed he had placed in the woods. Detectives and search crews returned to the forest, combing the undergrowth in search of the stick with the plastic bag. At the same time, digital analysts reviewed GPS data from Andrew's mobile phone. What they uncovered was yet another contradiction in his account. Records showed that the day before Katie disappeared, Andrew had visited his parents' home. Then, at some point during the visit, he turned off his phone for approximately 90 minutes. During that period, traffic cameras picked up his van, traveling toward the same wooded area where he would later claim the incident took place. As investigators dug deeper into the digital evidence, they uncovered something that turned their growing suspicion into undeniable confirmation. One particularly revealing discovery came from a digital forensics analysis of Andrew's personal devices. Experts were able to retrieve a series of text drafts, unsent messages written on his phone and computer. What stood out wasn't just their content, but their construction. Over the course of several weeks, Andrew had been meticulously writing, editing, and revising messages that mimicked Katie's communication style. By that point, detectives had traffic camera footage and GPS logs that aligned with his movements. After days of painstaking effort and multiple failed passes through the forest, a small but significant detail finally surfaced: the stick with a plastic bag tied to it. With renewed focus, search teams combed through the immediate area, examining every inch of terrain. But still, they found nothing. They brought Andrew out to the site under heavy supervision and asked him to guide them directly to the location. Without hesitation, Andrew pointed to a specific patch of ground, an area the team had already examined several times before. There didn't appear to be anything unusual about it. In fact, it was one of the first places they had searched. For a moment, there was doubt. Could they really have missed something? And then, as the forensic team began carefully excavating the soil, the horrifying truth emerged. Katie was there, right where Andrew had said she would be. For detectives, this was the final confirmation of what they had long suspected. With that final piece in place, the legal process moved swiftly. Investigators, along with psychologists consulted during the case, formed a shared theory. They believed that Andrew had been driven by deep resentment and an obsessive need for control. The trial began in November of 2022, and as expected, the courtroom was packed. Katie's family sat quietly, waiting for justice. Andrew initially entered a plea of not guilty, maintaining his previous claim that her death had been accidental. But as the prosecution began laying out the full scope of the evidence, each detail, each contradiction, each carefully planned step, something shifted. Only 3 days into the proceedings, Andrew suddenly changed his plea. Without warning, and to the astonishment of the court, he stood and admitted responsibility. He pleaded guilty to the murder of Katie Kenyon. Andrew Burfield was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after 32 years. The local police department received a call from a resident living in a trailer park in the nearby town of Clyde, Ohio. The caller expressed concern about a black Chevrolet that had been parked in the lot for some time. What caught the resident's attention was the strange condition of the vehicle. The windows were completely fogged up, as if it had been sitting there with moisture trapped inside. There was no movement around the car, and no sign of the driver. Responding to the call, officers arrived at the scene to investigate. It didn't take long for them to identify that the car was registered to a woman. But what they discovered inside the vehicle was deeply disturbing. Inside, they found Heather Bogle. The car itself was parked in an unusually careful manner. It was positioned precisely within the lines, as though the person who left it there had deliberately tried not to draw any attention. Every crime has its own story, and we're here to tell it to you, our dear viewers. Like, comment, and subscribe. Stay with us. Heather Bogle was born and raised in the heart of Sandusky County, Ohio, a modest, largely rural region nestled in the northern part of the state. It's the kind of place where life moves at a slower pace, where people know their neighbors, and where values like hard work, loyalty, and perseverance aren't just taught, they're lived. The local economy largely depends on manufacturing plants, small businesses, and farming, and the working-class community forms the very foundation of daily life there. Heather, like many in her town, grew up understanding the value of putting in an honest day's work and supporting the people around her, no matter the personal cost. From a very young age, Heather stood out, not because she was loud or attention-seeking, but quite the opposite. She had a presence that was both calm and reassuring. People remembered her for her radiant smile, her thoughtful eyes, and a quiet strength that seemed to guide her through the trials life inevitably brings. She wasn't one to stir up conflict or involve herself in needless drama. Instead, she carried herself with grace, humility, and an inner strength that became more and more evident as she navigated the responsibilities of adulthood. Heather kept her inner circle small but meaningful. She was fiercely loyal to her close friends and family, and above all, her world revolved around one person: her daughter, Mackenzie. Becoming a mother changed Heather's life in profound ways. As a single parent, she faced challenges that would have tested anyone's resolve. But Heather rose to meet each one with a sense of fierce determination. Every job she took, every sleepless night she endured, every early morning she faced before the sun had risen. It was all for Mackenzie. She once told a friend that everything she did had a purpose, and that purpose had a name: her daughter. Heather's friends and co-workers often described her as someone who never let life's obstacles defeat her. When times were hard, and they often were, she pushed forward with quiet courage. Whether she was managing rotating shifts at her job or dealing with personal matters that weighed heavily on her heart, Heather kept going. Her resilience wasn't loud or boastful. It was steady and consistent, like a river carving its way through stone. She was dependable, she was grounded, and she had a kind word for everyone, even when she herself was going through difficult times. As she approached her late 30s, Heather began to envision a different kind of future, one with greater stability and more opportunities, not just for herself, but most importantly for Mackenzie. She knew that to build the life she dreamed of, she would need to make sacrifices in the short term. With that vision in mind, Heather made the bold decision to go back to school to pursue a degree in nursing. It was a field that matched her nurturing nature and strong sense of responsibility, and it offered the promise of a more secure and fulfilling future. The road wasn't easy. To support herself and her daughter, Heather worked night shifts at a major manufacturing plant in nearby Clyde, one of the largest employers in the area. The work was grueling, long hours in a physically demanding environment, filled with the clatter of machines and the repetition of assembly lines. But the job came with one key advantage. It allowed her to attend classes during the day. Her schedule was relentless. Sleep became a luxury, and personal time was almost non-existent. Yet, despite the fatigue and constant juggling act, Heather remained focused and driven. Her days became a carefully choreographed routine, clocking in late at night, returning home to care for her daughter, then heading out to school during daylight hours. In between, she found moments, however brief, to study, prepare for exams, and dream about the day when she would walk across a stage in a cap and gown, degree in hand. Those who knew her best saw the toll it took on her, but also recognized the deep sense of purpose that fueled her every move. Heather never once considered giving up. Even in the midst of exhaustion, she never lost her sense of humor or her ability to connect with others. She had an easy way with people, an ability to listen, to empathize, to offer comfort even when she herself had very little left to give. Her kindness wasn't performative, it was genuine. Friends, co-workers, and those fortunate enough to know Heather Bogle often described her in very similar terms. Quiet but deeply thoughtful, with a sharp and observant mind that only revealed itself when she felt truly comfortable. She wasn't one to dominate a room or seek the spotlight. In fact, Heather often preferred to listen rather than speak, and when she did share her thoughts, they were measured, insightful, and often far more profound than people expected. There was a certain depth to her presence, something quietly magnetic that lingered long after she left a room. Heather didn't have time for drama, and she made no effort to be popular or admired in superficial ways. That simply wasn't her priority. She was the kind of woman who had learned, likely through life's harder lessons, to invest her energy wisely. Her focus remained fixed on the things that mattered most to her: raising her daughter with love and stability, furthering her education, and taking deliberate steps toward a better future. She wasn't chasing validation from others. She was building something real for herself and her child, one hard-earned brick at a time. But like anyone who has lived through hardship, Heather carried more within her than most could see at first glance. She had layers, complicated, human layers, that weren't always apparent to the outside world. Beneath her calm exterior was a woman who had endured emotional pain, setbacks, and the kind of disappointments that often go unspoken. Like so many people trying to put their life back together, Heather had experienced relationships that ended painfully and had moments where her future felt uncertain or overwhelming. She bore those experiences not with bitterness, but with quiet endurance. Those who knew her closely, friends who had earned her trust, co-workers who saw her daily strength, shared that she had recently come out of a particularly difficult romantic relationship. She didn't talk about it much. Heather was not the type to broadcast her struggles. But there were subtle signs that she was in a period of transition, choosing to distance herself from the people and influences that brought instability or emotional turmoil into her life. Her energy was shifting toward healing, toward peace, toward rebuilding. Her social media presence, specifically her Facebook page, offered gentle glimpses into her inner world. To a stranger scrolling through, her posts might have seemed ordinary. Snapshots of her daughter smiling, uplifting quotes about perseverance, messages about growth and renewal. But to those who paid close attention, her words carried emotional weight. Phrases about starting over, about never giving up, about refusing to be defined by the past. These weren't just digital musings. They were reflections of an inner journey, of a woman actively rewriting her story. Heather wasn't just surviving, she was striving to thrive. And that journey was beginning to bear fruit. Heather was nearing the final stretch of her coursework, on track to complete her nursing degree after years of effort, late nights, and personal sacrifice. That goal, once distant, was now within reach. Her grueling night shifts at the manufacturing plant were soon to come to an end, and a new chapter, one filled with hope and possibility, was about to begin. She had talked openly with friends and family about her aspirations. There were discussions about job interviews, maybe relocating to a safer, quieter neighborhood, and finally having the freedom to spend more quality time with Mackenzie. This wasn't just about making ends meet anymore. It was about transformation. For the first time in a long while, Heather saw a future she could believe in, and the people around her noticed the change. Her sister spoke of how much more focused she seemed. Coworkers remarked on her renewed energy. There was a spark in Heather's eyes, a sense of motivation and calm purpose that had taken root. She was moving forward, not recklessly, but intentionally. She had invested deeply in herself, mentally, emotionally, and financially. And slowly, that investment was beginning to pay off. Heather Bogle was not some passing face in a crowd. She was not a statistic to be summed up in one line. She was a real person, a devoted mother, a hardworking student, a friend with empathy, and above all, someone who fought hard for every ounce of progress she made. Her journey wasn't perfect, but it was honest. She had dreams, she had doubts, and she had strength in abundance. Then, on the morning of April 9th, 2015, something unexpected happened. Something that altered everything. Heather didn't come home. She had left for what should have been a routine day, part of her usual rhythm. But hours passed, then more. And when she failed to return home that evening, a growing sense of unease began to settle in the hearts of her loved ones. What had started as mild concern quickly escalated into something much more urgent. As one day turned into 2, and then 3, the questions began to stack up faster than the answers. Where was Heather? Who had she seen last? Did she say anything unusual? Had she made plans? Why was no one hearing from her? For her family, especially her daughter Mackenzie, the silence was a cruel and growing weight. Heather wasn't someone who disappeared without reason. She was responsible, especially when it came to her daughter, and the fact that no one could reach her was a glaring red flag. April 9th, 2015 began like so many days before it for Heather Bogle. Routine, ordinary, and shaped by the quiet rhythm of her hard-working life. The day carried no particular warning, no sign that anything unusual or unsettling was about to unfold. But within just 24 hours, a profound unease would spread throughout Sandusky County, Ohio, an area where the pace of life is steady and the boundaries of community are drawn close. In this part of the world, where most residents greet each other by name at the grocery store or wave from across the street, the idea that someone could simply vanish without explanation was nearly inconceivable. That's what made Heather's sudden disappearance so disturbing. She had responsibilities, goals, and a daughter who was the center of her life. There were no warning signs, no dramatic shifts in behavior. Heather was deeply grounded in the present, focused on building a better future. The sudden break in that pattern left everyone who knew her reeling. That morning, Heather had finished her night shift at the Whirlpool plant in Clyde, Ohio. It was just after 6 a.m. when she left work, stepped out into the dim spring light, and headed toward the parking lot. Her coworkers remembered nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of distress, no confrontation. Surveillance video confirmed that she had walked to her car alone. From that moment on, Heather Bogle seemed to have disappeared without a trace. When Heather failed to return home that morning, her family quickly grew concerned. Keeping quiet was not her style, especially when her daughter depended on her for her daily routine. She hadn't shown up to pick up Mackenzie, hadn't responded to texts or calls, and her phone had gone dead. Over time, concern turned to fear. By the evening of April 9th, Heather had been officially declared missing. Police began canvassing locations where Heather might have appeared, but none yielded results. Her family printed out flyers with her photo and posted them around the city, hoping that someone had seen her. Colleagues recalled her behavior over the past few days, trying to find at least some hint that she could have been planning to disappear. But there were no such signs. Everything pointed to the fact that Heather intended to return home, as always. Her car also did not appear in any of her usual places. CCTV cameras on the surrounding streets did not record her car in motion. It felt as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. Posts with requests for help began to appear on social networks. And although at first it looked like a tragic but perhaps explainable situation, soon everything took on a much more alarming tone. With each passing hour, the tension grew. Relatives began calling friends, colleagues, former partners, anyone who could know anything. The police department formed a special group to work on the missing person case. But despite their efforts, there was no trace of Heather in any hospital, hotel, or emergency room. Investigators had no motive or suspects. Even her mobile phone gave no hope. The signal disappeared almost immediately after she left the plant. Mackenzie began to have sleepless nights. She did not understand why her mother did not come home. The family tried to remain hopeful, but inside, everyone already felt that something terrible had happened. People who had not previously met Heather began to worry about her fate, sharing posts and joining the search. And then, just 24 hours after she disappeared, a call came in that changed the course of the investigation. The next day, April 10th, 2015, the police received a call from a trailer park in nearby Clyde. One of the residents noticed an unfamiliar black Chevrolet parked in the parking lot. Its windows were fogged up. The driver was nowhere to be seen. The car stood there for some time, not moving. When police arrived to investigate, they quickly determined that the car belonged to Heather Bogle. But what they found inside shattered the community's sense of safety. Heather, lifeless, was discovered of her own car. The trunk was locked. The car itself was neatly parked, as if whoever left it there had taken great care to avoid attracting attention. The condition of Heather's body immediately raised questions. While this is a story we will treat with caution, it is important to understand the gravity of what investigators found. The way she had been treated told investigators this was not an impulsive act. It was methodical, controlled, personal. The location of the car only deepened the mystery. The trailer park was tucked away off the main roads, not far from where Heather worked. It was not where she usually went. People living nearby did not recognize the car or hear or see anything out of the ordinary. No sounds, just a parked car sitting quietly in the early spring fog. As word of the discovery spread, the community's fear turned to grief and confusion. How could something so cruel, so deliberate happen to someone like Heather? Who could have done it? And why? Law enforcement now had a murder case, and they knew from the start that the pressure would be enormous. Heather wasn't a stranger. She was someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone who worked alongside friends and neighbors. The public wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. Forensic scientists searched the car. They took samples from the trunk, tested for DNA, checked fingerprints, and tested fibers. It took time to get the full results, but the early signs pointed to one thing. Whoever did this knew how to leave no obvious clues. There were no immediate suspects. Heather's phone was missing. Her purse was gone. But there was no sign of theft as a motive. Her car hadn't been ransacked. Her bank accounts hadn't been touched. There was no evidence that she'd been stolen. Instead, investigators began looking more closely at her personal life. The people she knew, the people she could trust. Heather had recently been in a romantic relationship, one that friends described as on and off, and possibly volatile. Some speculated there had been arguments, tensions, questions of jealousy. Law enforcement took note and began questioning people in her inner circle. One by one, friends, co-workers, and family members were called in for questioning. The case grew. Every possibility was considered. Was this a crime of passion? Was it someone from her past? An ex? A co-worker? A stranger? Someone she met online? But it wasn't that simple. Whoever committed this crime had taken steps to hide their identity. The physical evidence had been erased, or at least attempted to be. The location of her car appeared to be deliberate. Heather's phone was never found, meaning there were no GPS signals, recent text messages, or calls that could have guided the investigation. And there was something else that gave detectives pause. The calculated nature of the crime didn't match any recent incidents in the area. There were no similar homicides, no open cases that reflected this level. It seemed like someone had done this, or something like it, before. Back at the scene, the trailer park had become a makeshift hub of police activity. Officers scoured the area, hoping to find a lead, a witness, a camera, anything. But in an area where few people had CCTV and even fewer were awake in the early morning, there was little information. The car had no damage, no signs of forced entry. Investigators believed Heather had gotten into the car voluntarily, or had never gotten out of it. That pointed to a suspect she likely knew, the face she recognized. Someone who had access to her, who could approach her without causing alarm. But as the days passed and the investigation hit a dead end, the community's shock turned to disappointment. Online, amateur sleuths began to speculate. People began to whisper names. Rumors began to spread, some true, some fear. The sheriff's office offered a reward for information. Local news stations covered the story every night. Heather's family begged for help. Her sister, devastated, stood before cameras, begging the public for answers. "She didn't deserve this," she said, her voice shaking. "We just want justice. We want to know who did this to her." But behind the scenes, investigators were under increasing pressure, and cracks were beginning to show. In their rush to bring someone to justice, law enforcement soon began focusing on suspects who, in retrospect, never matched the facts. And while the public thought the case was on the verge of being solved, the truth was far more complicated. The real killer was still at large, and the investigation was about to take a turn that would raise serious questions. Questions not just about who killed Heather Bogle, but about how the system itself had almost let them get away with it. The lead investigator was Detective Sean O'Connell, a seasoned officer with a reputation for tenacity and strong instincts. From the outside, he seemed like the right man for the job. But as the weeks passed, what began as a hopeful quest for the truth slowly turned into a cautionary tale. One of tunnel vision, poor judgment, and the dangers of when pressure outweighs process. From the start, Detective O'Connell believed the key to solving the case lay in Heather's personal relationships. And that wasn't necessarily a bad lead. Statistically, most murders involve someone the victim knew. But what followed was a series of mistakes that not only derailed the investigation for years, but also nearly allowed the real killer to slip away entirely. O'Connell zeroed in on 3 people in Heather's circle, all women. One was a recent romantic partner of Heather's, a woman she'd been dating for months before her death. The relationship had reportedly ended on unspecified terms. Another was a woman Heather had reportedly exchanged messages with in the past. The third was a friend. O'Connell became convinced that these women, individually or together, were involved in Heather's death. But there was no physical evidence to support this theory. No DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitness statements, no digital trail linking them to the crime. Still, O'Connell doggedly pursued the lead. He claimed jealousy, betrayal, emotional instability, and he leaned heavily on motive, leaving the question of means and opportunity unclear. The families of the women involved soon grew concerned. They claimed their daughters were being targeted unfairly and without cause. At one point, law enforcement publicly named one of the women as a suspect, a move that drew sharp criticism, especially when it became clear that the evidence against her was circumstantial at best. What O'Connell didn't reveal, at least to the public, was that forensic testing had already begun to tell a different story. The DNA evidence found on Heather's body didn't match any of the women under investigation. In fact, it didn't match any known law enforcement database at the time. Rather than widen the scope of the investigation, however, O'Connell redoubled his efforts. He continued to pursue the women he identified, reportedly ignoring or downplaying forensic inconsistencies. Questions arose, not just from the public, but from within the justice system. Prosecutors, unable to move forward without clear evidence, grew increasingly concerned about the direction of the case. And Heather's family, though desperate for justice, grew concerned about the lack of progress and the seemingly one-sided investigation. Then came the tipping point. In 2017, an internal review was launched into Detective Sean O'Connell's conduct. What investigators found was deeply troubling. It appeared that O'Connell had withheld evidence, including DNA results, that pointed away from his prime suspects. He falsified witness statements, omitted key facts from his reports, and failed to follow up on credible leads that didn't fit his theory. The very process that was meant to uncover the truth was compromised by one misguided intent to bend evidence to fit a narrative, regardless of whether it was correct. O'Connell was removed from the case. Shortly thereafter, he was charged with tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice. In 2018, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to prison, a rare and sobering moment in which a law enforcement officer was held accountable for actively undermining a murder investigation. For the people of Sandusky County, the discovery was stunning. Not only had a young mother been murdered, but the man assigned to solve the crime had been leading the case astray for 2 critical years. And all the while, the real killer remained at large. After O'Connell was fired and the case fell apart, a new team of investigators took over. They began by going back to the beginning, reviewing the evidence, the autopsy report, digital traces, witness interviews, and, most importantly, forensic evidence. That's when something remarkable happened. As the new detectives combed through DNA evidence, they identified a male DNA profile, one that had remained unmatched for years. But now, with access to larger databases and more advanced testing, a potential lead emerged. The DNA matched a man named Daniel Myers, a quiet, unassuming co-worker of Heather's at the plant. He was someone who had completely disappeared from view during the initial investigation. There was no reason to suspect him, no obvious connections outside of the workplace, no previous convictions that linked him to violent behavior. He had never been questioned, never called, never even mentioned. And yet his DNA was now indisputably linked to Heather's body. Detectives zeroed in on Myers, digging into his past. What they found was almost immediately alarming. Daniel Myers had a history that hadn't been thoroughly investigated, controlling behavior, and a dark streak that had largely gone unnoticed. He had once been questioned years earlier in connection with a suspicious death, though charges were never filed. Those who knew him described him as manipulative, a man who could remain calm while hiding something much darker beneath. The theory that Heather had been killed by someone she trusted, someone she worked with, shattered previous assumptions. This was not a love triangle. This was not a spontaneous act of jealousy. 2 years of false leads, wasted time, and missed opportunities. But now, there was momentum. There was clarity. And there was hope that justice might finally be within reach. As the trial began to move toward trial, prosecutors prepared to tell their case. The truth, long buried beneath false assumptions, was finally beginning to emerge. By the time Daniel Myers was arrested and charged with Heather Bogle's murder in early 2017, the story had already taken on disturbing resonance in Sandusky County. What began as a horrific crime soon became a lesson in how justice can be delayed, not for lack of evidence, but for the dangerous consequences of pursuing the wrong suspect. Now, after 2 years of misdirection, a new team of investigators had assembled what they believed to be a smoking gun against the man they were certain took Heather's life. But before the trial could begin, the justice system had to untangle the damage done during the original investigation. Detective Sean O'Connell's misconduct had called nearly every element of the case into question. Evidence had to be re-examined, old interviews revisited, and legal strategies adapted. Prosecutors had to ensure that the court not only convicted the right man, but that he would withstand legal scrutiny. The integrity of the case was now as important as its outcome. Daniel Myers, now charged with capital murder and several related charges, has pleaded not guilty. His defense argued that the presence of his DNA did not necessarily mean he committed the murder. They suggested that contact could have occurred earlier or through secondary transmission. But for prosecutors, that argument was irrelevant. Heather had no known personal relationship with Myers. There was no evidence that they had ever communicated, texted, or met outside of the workplace. Myers had never been seen with Heather in a context that would explain the intimate nature of the DNA found on her body. For the state, the case was chillingly simple. Daniel Myers, a man with a dark past and a habit of control and manipulation, targeted Heather Bogle. He waited until she was vulnerable, just after a night shift, likely tired, unsuspecting, and alone. Investigators believed he lured her to a secluded area, tied her up, and carried out a brutal, premeditated attack. He then tried to erase all the evidence. The trial officially began in 2019, 4 years after Heather's death. Emotions ran high in the courtroom. Heather's family, many of whom wore purple, the color associated with domestic violence awareness, filled the gallery each day. Her sister, Jennifer Bogle, had become a vocal advocate for justice, speaking at press conferences, giving interviews, and not letting her sister's memory fade. Now she watched as the man accused of taking Heather's life sat calmly before a judge and jury. The prosecution presented a methodical, evidence-based case. At the center of their argument was DNA. Specifically, a male DNA profile found on Heather's body that matched Daniel Myers. But DNA wasn't the only evidence. They presented forensic evidence from the crime scene, phone records, and statements from people who knew Myers personally, particularly women who described his abusive, controlling, and erratic behavior in the past. The prosecution also emphasized the planning that went into Heather's murder. It was not an impulsive act. But despite this, Myers left out one crucial detail. He left behind DNA. When it was the defense's turn, they tried to cast doubt on the timeline and the chain of evidence. They argued that the investigation was tainted by earlier misconduct. Sean O'Connell's frame-up, they argued, should make jurors question whether anything could be trusted. If the original detective had manipulated the case before, how could jurors be sure that the current charges weren't the result of the same systemic problems? But prosecutors fought back. The evidence that led to Myers only emerged after O'Connell's dismissal. In fact, it was O'Connell's refusal to consider that very DNA that allowed Myers to avoid scrutiny in the first place. Far from being part of a compromised case, the evidence against Myers was a blank slate that investigators discovered after correcting the original errors. It was a new investigation, with new oversight, new methods, and a renewed emphasis on evidence over speculation. The jury listened intently as both sides laid out their cases. For many, the most chilling moments came when they saw the physical evidence, images of Heather's car and the autopsy reports detailing the brutality of the crime. They were shown sparingly and carefully, but they made one thing devastatingly clear. Whoever did this had gone to great lengths to destroy not just evidence, but dignity. As the trial progressed, a clearer picture of Daniel Myers emerged. He was not just a quiet colleague with no criminal record. He was someone who had quietly terrorized the women in his personal life for years, leaving no public trace but a wealth of private scars. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the tension was palpable. The courtroom sat in near silence, bracing itself for a verdict that had taken 4 years to reach. Hours passed, then a day. And then on the second day of deliberations, the jury returned. Daniel Myers was found guilty on all charges, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. As the verdict was read, Heather's family wept quietly. Some held hands, others simply bowed their heads. For them, This was not a moment of celebration. It was a long overdue closure to a journey that began with unimaginable grief, passed through the betrayal of a system, and ended with accountability. Justice, though delayed, had finally been served. At sentencing, the prosecution asked for the maximum: life in prison without the possibility of parole. They cited the premeditated nature of the crime, the attempts to destroy evidence, and Myers' ongoing pattern of violence. The judge agreed. Daniel Myers was sentenced to life without parole, ensuring he would never be free again. In his final moments in court, Myers offered no apologies, no explanation. In the early hours of March 1st, 2001, while most of the city slept, a call came through to emergency services. The time was exactly 12:16 a.m. On the other end of the line was a man who spoke with an unnerving sense of calm. His voice was measured, steady, almost too composed for someone in crisis. The caller identified himself as Colin Wheel. Colin explained that his wife had taken a serious fall. According to him, she had fallen down the staircase inside their home and was now unconscious and unresponsive. The dispatcher, trained to stay calm and issue life-saving instructions, immediately urged Colin to begin cardiopulmonary resuscitation on his wife. Colin responded that he was already performing it. Without hesitation, emergency services dispatched an ambulance to the address. When paramedics arrived at the scene moments later, they were met with an unsettling sight that brought them to a sudden halt. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. Mary Goff entered the world on December 22, 1973. A cold winter day in Ireland that would forever mark the arrival of someone truly special. The youngest of her siblings, Mary wasn't merely the baby of the family. She quickly became its beating heart. There was a quiet charm about her, a softness that made everyone around her feel at ease. She brought light into the home in subtle ways, through her laughter, her kindness, and a gentle energy that never demanded attention but always invited it. From a young age, Mary formed a deep and unique connection with her father. James Goff was a hard-working man, known for his dedication to his family and his firm but loving approach to parenting. He adored his daughter beyond measure, and Mary, in turn, idolized him. She became what many would call a daddy's girl, not in a spoiled sense, but in the way a child naturally gravitates towards someone who offers unwavering support and unconditional love. Their bond was tender and unshakable, the kind built on mutual trust, shared jokes, and long talks over tea at the kitchen table. The Goff family lived a modest life. They weren't wealthy, nor did they aim to be. Their days were grounded in honesty and routine. James worked long hours to provide, and Mary's mother held the household together with quiet resilience. There were no extravagant luxuries, no exotic holidays or sparkling new cars. But they had what mattered most: closeness, dignity, and a home built on strong moral ground. Mary, even as a child, reflected those values. She was never a child prone to tantrums or rebellion. Her nature was balanced. She was friendly, considerate, and generous with her time. Whether helping a neighbor carry grocery or babysitting for a relative, Mary had an instinct to care. Her sense of responsibility appeared early and only grew stronger as she matured. In school, she was bright, but often disengaged. While her teachers saw potential in her sharp mind, Mary found little interest in abstract academics. Mathematics felt irrelevant, and history seemed like a long list of other people's problems. She preferred the tangible, things she could touch, people she could talk to, lives she could impact directly. She wasn't lazy or unmotivated. She simply had a different compass guiding her. Then, in 1989, that inner compass was tested in the most tragic of ways. James Goff passed away suddenly. It was not a long illness, nor an accident that could have been predicted. His death was like a lightning strike, sudden, unforgiving, and leaving no time for goodbyes. Mary was only 15 years old when her world was torn apart. The house, once warm with her father's voice and humor, grew quiet in his absence. The loss was like a fog, thick, heavy, and disorienting. The Goff family reeled, each member grieving in their own way. Mary's mother, though strong, found herself overwhelmed by both sorrow and the sudden pressure of managing everything alone. Her brothers, too, struggled to make sense of a home without its anchor. But it was Mary, still just a teenager, who somehow became their steadying force. She absorbed her pain in silence, choosing instead to be a source of comfort to those around her. Her emotional strength in those months became legendary in her family. To this day, relatives recall how she never once complained, how she smiled through tears, how she kept them going. Financial pressure came quickly in the wake of James's death. Without hesitation, Mary stepped into adulthood. She took on a weekend job at a local cafe, and though the work was tiring, she never missed a shift. Her goal was simple: to ease the burden on her mother. When she finished school in 1991, she made a decision many wouldn't have had the courage to make. She gave up on further education to work full-time. She became a bartender at a local pub, a job that suited her social nature. It wasn't glamorous, but it allowed her to earn a living and still be part of a community. The bar became her second home. She learned quickly how to handle difficult patrons, how to read people, and how to maintain grace under pressure. In many ways, this role became her unofficial education, teaching her more about life and human nature than textbooks ever could. Life rolled on with simplicity. Mary worked, paid her share of the bills, and spent evenings with close friends. Weekends might include a night out or a small family gathering, but her life remained steady, almost predictable. Then, in 1993, that steady rhythm was interrupted, though not by tragedy this time, but by a stranger named Colin Wheel. Colin had first appeared at the bar one rainy Thursday evening. Recovering from a leg injury, he had taken to stopping by more regularly, nursing a drink and chatting with staff. 2 years older than Mary, Colin was quick with a joke and often caught in deep thought. He wasn't loud or attention-seeking, but there was something magnetic about him. Mary noticed it right away. Their conversations started small, comments about the weather, a shared laugh over a regular customer's antics, but soon deepened into something more meaningful. Colin had grown up in a nearby town in a similarly modest household. His background was working class, but his mind had always leaned toward the digital world. He had studied computer science, graduated, and secured a well-paying job as an analyst. His world was structured, organized, and forward-looking. But despite his technological mind, he had a deeply human side, empathetic, observant, and introspective. Mary and Colin's connection grew slowly. At first, there were no grand declarations or romantic gestures. If anything, he seemed to view her as a confidant, someone he could talk to about anything. Mary, who had long since learned the value of listening, gave him her attention without expectation. Their friendship blossomed into something genuine, full of late-night chats, shared stories, and a growing mutual trust. Eventually, Colin became a fixture in Mary's social life. He met her friends, came to gatherings, and slowly integrated himself into her world. And then, after months of ambiguity, Colin asked her out on a proper date. From that moment on, their relationship grew steadily. Their bond deepened, grounded in shared values and mutual respect. When they introduced each other to their families, it was as though the final pieces of a puzzle had fallen into place. Mary's mother was immediately fond of Colin, praising his manners and the way he looked at Mary. Her brothers respected him, seeing in him someone steady and sincere. Likewise, Colin's parents welcomed Mary warmly, charmed by her genuine nature and quick wit. To everyone around them, this was the beginning of something permanent. Colin checked all the boxes. He had a reliable job, a car, and financial stability. He made plans and followed through. Mary's loved ones saw him not only as a partner, but as a potential husband. And Mary herself, who had never been one to daydream too much, began to picture a future that included him. She imagined a life filled with shared meals, maybe children, and a home of their own. But life, as Mary had already learned, doesn't always go as planned. Almost 2 years into their relationship, Colin ended things. There was no heated argument, no betrayal, no warning signs she could clearly recall. Just a quiet decision delivered with cold finality. Colin said he no longer saw a future between them. And then, he left. Mary was stunned. She hadn't prepared for heartbreak, not from someone who had held her hand so tightly. She asked him why. He didn't offer an answer. No explanations, no long discussions, just silence. After the unexpected breakup, Mary Goff began to quietly unravel. Outwardly, she tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but within, she was collapsing under the weight of emotional confusion. The world that had once felt grounded and familiar suddenly felt unpredictable, foreign. Day by day, her energy faded. She started withdrawing from friends, avoiding gatherings, even skipping simple routines like grocery runs or phone calls. Her home, once filled with warmth and personal touches, became a quiet, dim retreat. A place to hide from the world and all the questions it kept demanding she answer. She fixated on the breakup, turning every moment over in her mind. What had she done wrong? Was there something she had said that had pushed Colin away? Or worse, something she had failed to say? The night before he ended things, she had gone out with friends, a rare night of laughter and distraction. Colin had called the house while she was out. When she didn't answer, he left no message. That missed call began to torment her. Could that have been the catalyst? Had she inadvertently given him a reason to doubt her? The self-doubt began to eat away at her self-esteem. She replayed every detail of their last weeks together, looking for signs she might have missed. But the silence from Colin offered no clarity, only deeper confusion. Even Mary's mother, who had embraced Colin like a son, struggled to make sense of what had happened. She picked up the phone one afternoon, her hands trembling slightly, and dialed his number. She didn't want to interfere, but she hoped for at least a glimmer of honesty, a simple explanation that could help her daughter begin to heal. But when Colin answered, his voice was cold and clipped. His tone bordered on defensive, even dismissive. He offered no insight, no apology, just a harsh remark that it wasn't his fault Mary was like that. The words stung. What did he mean? Like what? There was no closure, just emotional wreckage. Mary was left with a relationship that had dissolved without reason and wounds that couldn't be bandaged because they were invisible to the eye. She cried alone, often at night, when the stillness around her matched the stillness inside. But slowly, inch by inch, she began the painful climb back to herself. Time, as it often does, became her greatest ally. As the months passed, Mary began to rebuild. She stopped trying to decode Colin's motives and instead turned her attention to the one person she could control, herself. With quiet determination, she began to say yes to life again. A surprising opportunity came when she was offered a job working behind the scenes on the set of the film Rob Roy, which was shooting in Scotland. At first, she was hesitant, but something inside urged her to try. The environment was dynamic and high-paced, and Mary thrived. Her natural talent for organization, her calm under pressure, and her warm personality quickly made her stand out. Crew members often remarked on her reliability. She was the kind of person who could juggle tasks while still remembering everyone's coffee order. So impressive was her work ethic that she was soon offered another position, this time on a larger project filming in Scotland. It was an exciting offer, one that could have signaled a new chapter in her life. But Mary declined. The decision surprised many, especially those who had witnessed her growth. But for Mary, it wasn't about ambition. She felt a pull to stay near home. Maybe it was her mother who still leaned on her. Or maybe it was the comfort of the familiar. Or maybe, deep down, it was the lingering presence of someone she wasn't yet ready to fully let go of. And then, just as fate often moves in strange circles, Colin appeared again. It had been 6 months since their painful breakup. Their meeting wasn't planned, nor was it dramatic, but it happened. And when their eyes met, there was a quiet tension in the air, an undeniable current of something unfinished. Neither one said much at first, but both recognized what was still there, a spark, a thread, a connection they couldn't fully sever. This time, they approached things more cautiously. The romance resumed, but not impulsively. They talked, really talked, about the future. It wasn't just hopeful chatter. It was intentional, serious. They agreed that if they were to be together again, it had to mean something lasting. Mary soon found a new job working as a secretary at a respected local law firm. The role was structured and allowed her to apply the skills she had honed over years of juggling responsibilities. She excelled quickly, impressing not only with her professionalism, but with the grace she brought into even the most stressful days. Colin, for his part, appeared just as stable. His career in technology continued to flourish. In 1997, he took a big step. He purchased a house from his grandfather. It was a modest home, but full of character and potential. Together, Mary and Colin moved in, decorating it with care. They filled the rooms with framed memories, hand-picked furniture, and dreams of a shared future. Friends and family assumed the next chapter would be marriage. Mary waited for a proposal, not with impatience, but with a quiet hopefulness. She imagined it often, the setting, the moment, the words. She had forgiven him, given him a second chance. In her heart, she believed it would all be worth it. But life had another twist in store. In 1998, an incident occurred that would change everything. One night, Colin made a grave decision. He got behind the wheel of a vehicle after consuming alcohol. As he drove, his car collided with that of a neighbor couple, an older husband and wife known to the community. The woman, age 61, was in the passenger seat. Tragically, she did not survive the crash. Her husband, though physically injured, lived. Colin himself walked away without serious harm. Shock spread through the neighborhood. But the aftermath was not what many expected. Though initially investigated for driving under the influence, Colin was never formally charged with that offense. Instead, the case concluded with a conviction for careless driving. He received a fine, a penalty many felt did not match the gravity of what had happened. Mary remained by his side during the ordeal. She insisted to friends and family that Colin was not a reckless man, that the tragedy was just that, a horrible, tragic mistake. But privately, she noticed things that troubled her. Colin spoke little of remorse. Instead, he pointed to the rainy road conditions, insisting the accident wasn't truly his fault. His detachment unsettled some, and over time, those who once defended him began to see something different in his demeanor. Something guarded, something cold. Later that same year, while vacationing in the Canary Islands, Colin proposed. It was a picturesque moment, carefully orchestrated. The location was beautiful, the ring well chosen, and the setting ideal. Mary said yes, but the moment felt more like a performance than a surprise. From that point forward, the wedding planning unfolded with similar precision. Every detail was calculated, meticulously chosen invitations, color schemes, and seating charts. Colin's need for control extended into every aspect of the event. On September 9th, 2000, the wedding took place. From the outside, it looked perfect. The venue was elegant, the guest list thoughtfully curated. But those who knew Mary well sensed something beneath the surface. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Her laughter felt rehearsed. There was a weight to her presence, as if she were holding something inside. Then, during the ceremony, as Mary stood facing Colin, something cracked. The vows began, and suddenly, tears welled in her eyes. Her voice trembled, and before anyone could react, she broke down. She turned, clutched her dress, and without a word, rushed down the aisle and out of the building. The silence that followed was absolute, so thick that it almost hummed. Her bridesmaids, momentarily frozen by shock, quickly snapped into action and followed her, whispering her name with concern as they caught up outside. Some guests whispered that it must have been nerves. Others speculated it was the emotion of the day catching up with her. Perhaps the painful absence of her father, whose death so many years ago still left a visible ache in her. It would have been understandable. For a woman who had spent most of her life carrying the weight of loss with quiet strength, a wedding could easily stir that pain to the surface. But not everyone was convinced. There was something deeper in Mary's outburst, something unspoken and urgent. Her mother, watching from the front pew, felt her stomach twist. She had never seen her daughter look like that before. So conflicted, so vulnerable. Still, no one pressed too hard. After a brief pause, and with Mary eventually returning to the venue, the ceremony resumed. No explanation was offered. None was demanded. Shortly afterward, the newlyweds left for their honeymoon, an ambitious multi-country trip across Asia that had been organized by Colin with meticulous attention to detail. Flights, hotels, sightseeing, it had all been scheduled down to the hour. To friends, it seemed romantic. But to Mary's mother, the tightly controlled nature of the trip hinted at something else entirely. When they returned weeks later, Mary seemed changed. Not dramatically at first, but in small ways that, when noticed together, formed a troubling pattern. The woman who had once worn bold colors and bright lipstick now favored dull, muted tones. Her wardrobe shifted to long sleeves and high necklines, even on warm days. Her voice, once confident and warm, had become softer, almost hesitant. She stopped attending social events. Calls from friends often went unanswered, and invitations to coffee or lunch were gently declined, unless Colin was included. To her family, it felt like Mary's world had been rearranged, and not by her own hand. Conversations became brief, and her laughter, once the kind that could light up a room, was rarely heard. Her mother noticed immediately, and felt a growing unease each time she visited the couple's home. Mary always said she was fine, but her eyes betrayed her. Something wasn't right. Even Colin had changed. The man who once complimented Mary in front of others, who once smiled proudly at her across the room, now spoke to her in clipped, cold tones. There was no shouting, no visible aggression, but there was distance. A strange, stilted tension that filled the air like static. And Mary, for reasons no one could understand, never said a word about it. Weeks turned to months, but the sadness surrounding Mary only deepened. Her spark had dimmed, and despite efforts from those around her to lift her spirits, she remained emotionally distant, like she was living beside her life, not in it. Then, half a year after the wedding, the silence was shattered by a 999 call that would change everything. It was the early morning hours of March 1st, 2001. At precisely 12:16 a.m., emergency services received a calm, almost eerily composed call from a man at a private residence. The voice on the line was that of Colin Wheel. He reported that his wife had suffered a fall. She had, he said, tumbled down the stairs and was now unresponsive. The dispatcher, trained for emergencies like this, immediately instructed him to begin CPR. Colin claimed he was already doing so. An ambulance was dispatched without delay. When paramedics arrived at the couple's home, what they found stopped them in their tracks. Mary lay at the base of the staircase in a position that did not appear consistent with a typical fall. Something about the scene felt staged. The arrangement, the absence of bruising consistent with tumbling, and the fact that she was still positioned in a way that made CPR virtually impossible. It all raised immediate red flags. The emergency responders quickly assessed the situation. Despite repeated attempts to revive her, Mary showed no signs of life. It was clear that precious minutes had already passed by the time help arrived. Colin stood off to the side, watching their efforts with a blank expression. One paramedic later recalled how unsettling it was. How he kept asking in a flat, almost mechanical tone, "Is she alive? Is she alive?" Over and over again. There was no visible emotion, no panic, no desperation, no tears. Just repetition. Cold, expressionless repetition. At the hospital, 27-year-old Mary Goff was officially pronounced dead. Colin arrived shortly after the ambulance, driving himself in his own car. Staff at the hospital watched closely as he entered. Unlike so many others they'd seen arrive after losing a loved one, he didn't break down. He didn't ask to see her. He didn't even ask what had happened. Instead, he calmly began signing paperwork, barely speaking. It was during this quiet moment that a nurse noticed something troubling. As Colin leaned forward to fill out a form, his shirt shifted. On his torso were visible red marks, scratches, the kind that doesn't occur by accident. Startled, the nurse quickly made note and informed the attending physician. Within the hour, law enforcement had been notified. Later that day, detectives arrived to interview Colin. His recounting of events was carefully worded. He claimed that February 28th had been like any other day. They had both gone to work, he said, and later that evening, they attended a holistic health seminar together. Mary had recently become interested in wellness, and the event had been her idea. Afterward, he said, they returned home. They watched television, nothing remarkable. Then, sometime after midnight, while he remained downstairs, he claimed to have heard a loud crash from the stairwell. He ran to find Mary at the bottom, unconscious. Her sleeve, he noted, was torn, likely from the fall, he insisted. But detectives were skeptical. Something didn't fit. When questioned about the scratches on his body, Colin was visibly thrown. He stammered, searching for a response. He hadn't expected that detail to come up. He eventually offered a vague response, claiming he had scratched himself on something. Maybe a door frame or while moving boxes, he couldn't quite remember. Then, as if to prove there was nothing suspicious, he removed his shirt in front of the investigators. When pressed further about the scratches, Colin's confidence wavered. His story shifted uncomfortably. He flatly denied that there had been any argument between him and Mary that night. He claimed there was no conflict, no raised voices, no physical altercation. Just a tragic accident. Just a fall. But the more he spoke, the more he unraveled. His answers lacked conviction. His gaze wandered, and he began fumbling over details he had previously delivered with certainty. Realizing they had pushed him to the edge, detectives temporarily stepped back. The interrogation paused, but the damage had been done. The air had changed. Colin's cracks were showing, and investigators were now certain. He was lying. Mary's family, too, had begun seeing Colin in a new, sobering light. In the days following her death, his behavior grew increasingly bizarre. Cold, disengaged. Rather than involving himself in the difficult and emotional task of arranging his wife's funeral, Colin handed it over to her devastated relatives, as though it were a chore, not a tribute. He offered no input, no ideas, no effort. It was as if the loss meant nothing. At the funeral, Colin appeared to play his part. He wore the suit, stood near the coffin, shook hands with mourners. But to those who had truly known Mary, the people who had watched her love, laugh, and live, the performance fell flat. His grief was hollow. His sadness, rehearsed. Not a single tear was seen, and his eulogy was curiously impersonal, as if describing a co-worker, not a partner. Suspicion was mounting, and police called Colin back for a second interview. This time, his story evolved. No longer able to deny the injuries, Colin tried to explain them away. According to him, she had accidentally scratched him in that fleeting moment. He added that she had just stepped out of the shower before the fall, which he claimed explained her torn clothing and fragile condition. But once again, his words did not match the evidence. The autopsy results, delivered shortly after, were devastating to his already crumbling narrative. The pathologist's findings were conclusive. Mary's body bore no injuries consistent with a staircase fall. Nothing matched the story Colin had told. Nothing at all. Worse still, the forensic timeline shattered his version of events. The examination revealed that Mary had died much earlier than Colin had reported. By the time he had called emergency services, she had likely already been gone for several hours. Soon after, a chilling discovery was made inside the home: a stretched bathrobe belt. It was frayed at one end and matched others found in the couple's home. It belonged to Colin. It had not been tucked away or hidden, just left there as if its purpose hadn't crossed his mind. But to investigators, it was a silent witness, and its presence raised disturbing questions. There had been no forced entry, no signs of struggle elsewhere in the home, no indications of anyone else being involved. All signs pointed to one conclusion: Mary had died inside her home, at the hands of the only person with her that night. With pressure building, police expanded their investigation. They turned their attention to Colin's digital activity: emails, online searches, anything that might provide motive or premeditation. Colin, ever methodical, had erased his browsing history. But what he didn't realize was that his employer, like many large tech companies, automatically backed up internal computers to a secure server. And what was retrieved from those backups shocked even the most seasoned detectives. The digital footprint painted a sinister picture. For over 7 months, long before the wedding had even taken place, Colin had been researching ways to kill his wife. He had spent countless hours reading through archived crime stories and old police case files. One case stood out in particular, that of Henry Louis Wallace, a known serial offender. Colin had read the details again and again. He had even saved articles about Wallace's methods and how he had managed to escape detection for so long. The pattern was clear. Colin had used this knowledge as inspiration. But the motive, ultimately, was as cold as it was clear. Money. Just before Mary's death, Colin had taken out a life insurance policy worth £200,000 sterling in her name. And only weeks before she died, he had doubled it to £400,000 sterling. The policy's clause stated that the full payout would be valid only during the first 10 years of marriage. That window had just opened. The timing was no coincidence. It was calculated, cruel, intentional. Yet as disturbing as that was, the story didn't end with financial gain. In the data recovered from his work computer, police also uncovered Colin's frequent visits to online dating websites, many of which catered to alternative lifestyles and open relationships. His activity was not casual browsing. He had created detailed profiles, messaged dozens of women, and maintained active conversations with several, even while Mary was still alive. One woman in particular stood out. Helen, a teacher from England. Colin had told Helen he was a widower. He claimed his wife had died in a tragic car crash. He even discussed moving to England, going as far as to inquire about rental properties near her home. Investigators would later confirm that he had scheduled property viewings and saved moving checklists. To Colin, Mary was not a partner. She was a roadblock to a new life, one he had already begun constructing before she was even gone. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Colin remained free on bail for a short time. He was required to stay in the country, surrender his passport, and report to the police regularly. He did not attempt to flee, at least not at first. During this period, he began telling friends and family that he was struggling with depression. He said he missed Mary deeply, that he had made mistakes, that he felt lost without her. Some believed him. Others didn't know what to think. His behavior fluctuated. He was seen walking alone along beaches and sitting in parks for hours. He told some he had no purpose left in life. Then, in March 2003, nearly 2 years after Mary's death, Colin disappeared. He had driven to Howth, a rugged and beautiful peninsula outside Dublin known for its towering cliffs and coastal views. His car was found parked near the edge of the cliffs, engine cold, door locked. Inside the vehicle were his keys, wallet, and mobile phone. A full year had passed since Colin Wheel vanished along the windswept cliffs of Howth, Ireland. Then, in the sweltering heat of the summer of 2004, the truth surfaced in the most unexpected way. On a bustling island in the Mediterranean, Majorca, Spain, a sharp-eyed tourist visiting from Ireland stepped into a popular local bar for a cold drink. Behind the counter was a man who looked eerily familiar. His hair was darker now, and he wore sunglasses indoors, but there was something about him, his posture, his voice, his smirk, something instantly recognizable. The tourist didn't say a word right away. Instead, they observed. They asked the bartender his name, made casual conversation. The name he gave was not Colin Wheel, but Sean Delaney, a name tied to no visible past. But the encounter lingered in the tourist's mind. Back in Ireland, they reported the sighting to authorities, and soon, the man's true identity was uncovered. Colin had faked his own death. He had fled Ireland and assumed a false identity by fraudulently obtaining the birth certificate of a former neighbor, someone who had died young and left behind no public record of adult life. But Colin's carefully crafted escape plan came crashing down in July of 2004, when Spanish authorities, acting on an international warrant, arrested him without incident. He reportedly made no attempt to resist. His demeanor, according to arresting officers, was almost indifferent, as if he had expected the day would come. He was briefly held in custody in Spain, then extradited back to Ireland under tight security. There was no press conference, no dramatic airport scenes, just a quiet return to the country where justice had waited patiently for him. In April 2005, Colin shocked everyone once again, but this time it was with 2 words: "Guilty, Your Honor." After years of lies, calculated deceit, manipulation, and evasion, the man who had once stood silently over Mary's coffin finally admitted what investigators and loved ones had long suspected. There would be no lengthy trial, no courtroom drama, no opportunity for him to twist the narrative in his favor once again. By pleading guilty to the murder of his wife, Colin spared Mary's family the agony of reliving every gruesome detail in court. Colin Wheel was sentenced to life in prison with no eligibility for parole for many years to come. In the early hours of October 6th, at approximately 2 a.m., the quiet calm of the residential neighborhood was shattered without warning. Without a moment's hesitation, Oksana leapt out of bed and rushed to the front window. What she saw outside froze her in place. Her heart dropped. She called out to her husband, and together, still in their pajamas, barefoot and trembling with dread, they hurried downstairs. But by the time they reached the front of the building, it was already too late. She knelt beside her, gently holding her hand, whispering for her to stay awake, to stay with them, to keep her eyes open. By the time medical help arrived, Zenida Solinari had already lost consciousness. Within minutes, she was gone. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. Zenida Solinari came into the world on a cold winter morning, February 18, 1982, in a humble provincial town nestled in the rolling hills of southwestern Moldova. Life in that corner of Eastern Europe was often quiet, but it was not easy, especially for families like hers, who struggled to make a living amidst economic hardship. Zenida was the firstborn of 2 daughters in a modest household where love was abundant, but money was always in short supply. Her parents, both hard-working individuals, labored from dawn until late into the evening. Her father held jobs in local agriculture and construction when available, while her mother took on seasonal work and cleaned houses to keep food on the table. Despite their efforts, the family rarely had more than the bare essentials. From an early age, Zenida understood the value of perseverance. She shared a close bond with her younger sister Oksana, who was born 4 years after her. The sisters grew up like best friends, always side by side, offering each other the kind of support and understanding only siblings can provide. Their bond became a source of strength, especially during the difficult moments life would inevitably bring. As she entered her teenage years, Zenida blossomed into a beautiful young woman. She was quiet and introspective, but carried an inner strength that many admired. Like many girls her age, she began to explore the world of emotions and relationships. At school, she met a boy, handsome, charming, and slightly older. Their youthful romance quickly turned serious, and within a few months, Zenida discovered she was expecting a child. The news came as a shock to both of them, but while she tried to stay calm and make sense of what lay ahead, the boy panicked and soon disappeared from her life entirely. The Solinari household, though shaken by the unexpected pregnancy, chose to face the situation with courage. Her parents, while disappointed and concerned, were not the kind to turn their backs on family. They spoke at length about the options available, but ultimately decided that terminating the pregnancy was not something they could morally or emotionally support. They worried about how such a decision could affect Zenida's health or fertility later on. Most of all, they wanted her to know she wouldn't be alone. In November 1998, at the age of just 16, Zenida gave birth to a baby girl whom she lovingly named Vitalia. Though still a child herself in many ways, she embraced motherhood with a maturity far beyond her years. With the help of her parents, she balanced diapers and midnight feedings with her final years of school. After graduating, Zenida found herself faced with an increasingly uncertain future. Opportunities in her town were limited, and jobs were scarce. She worked whenever she could, babysitting, cleaning, helping out at markets, but these odd jobs barely covered the cost of living, let alone allowed for long-term planning. She began to dream of something better, something far from the narrow streets of her hometown. By the time she turned 21, Zenida had made a life-altering decision. She would leave Moldova in search of a more stable and promising life, not just for herself, but for her daughter. She chose Italy, a country she had heard was more welcoming to foreign workers and full of opportunities for those willing to work hard. In the spring of 2004, she packed their few belongings, kissed her parents and sister goodbye, and boarded a bus bound for Bergamo, a picturesque city in northern Italy surrounded by the Alps. Upon arrival, Zenida was struck by the beauty of her new surroundings: historic architecture, cobblestone streets, and the hum of daily life so different from what she had known. She quickly found a small apartment to rent and began working as a waitress at a busy local trattoria. The hours were long and the language barrier initially daunting, but Zenida was determined. Her focus was on giving Vitalia the chance for a brighter future. Her dedication didn't go unnoticed. With her graceful demeanor, warm smile, and striking physical features, she began to attract attention from some of the restaurant's regular customers. But despite this interest, Zenida made it clear. She was not seeking fleeting attention. She wanted stability, emotional safety, and a partner who would not only love her, but also accept her daughter as part of the equation. One day, while waiting tables, she met Maurizio Quattrocchi, a tall, confident man with a calm manner and kind eyes. He was nearly 12 years her senior and worked in construction as a stonemason and interior finisher. From the moment they met, he was persistent in his charm. Maurizio brought flowers to the restaurant, left generous tips, and soon began inviting Zenida and her daughter on weekend outings to scenic spots in and around Bergamo. He was attentive, always asking how they were doing, and made an effort to connect with young Vitalia, bringing her little gifts and making her laugh. Zenida was touched. No one had ever treated her and her daughter with such tenderness and consistency. Though cautious at first, she gradually allowed herself to believe that this man might be different. The age difference didn't faze her. What mattered more was how he made her feel, seen, supported, and respected. Within months, their relationship evolved into something more serious. Maurizio expressed a desire to adopt Vitalia officially if they ever married, a gesture that deeply moved Zenida and made her feel he was truly invested in their future together. By the end of that same year, after just 6 months of dating, Maurizio proposed. Overwhelmed by emotion and hope, Zenida accepted. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by security, love, and a sense of belonging. However, not all was as it seemed. Unbeknownst to Zenida, her fiancé had a complicated past. Over the years, Maurizio had come under police scrutiny for a variety of nonviolent offenses. He had been involved in minor fraud cases and had a history of purchasing and reselling stolen items. There were also a few instances involving reckless driving. Though none of these incidents had led to serious legal consequences, they painted a picture of someone who hadn't always made the best choices. Yet during their courtship, he kept these details hidden. Zenida only learned about his record after they were already married. When the truth emerged, she was hurt, but chose to believe that people could change. She convinced herself that those incidents were mistakes from his younger years and not reflective of the man he was becoming. She clung to the hope that the love he had shown her and her daughter was real and would outweigh whatever shadows lingered from his past. Even when he occasionally showed flashes of a temper, she told herself it was stress or exhaustion and didn't read too much into it. In 2005, the couple held a simple but heartfelt wedding ceremony attended by a few close friends and colleagues. They even managed a modest honeymoon in Spain, traveling through Barcelona and Valencia, taking in the sights and sharing their hopes for the future. Upon their return to Bergamo, Maurizio followed through on his promise and legally adopted Vitalia, who had already started calling him Papa with affection. Later that same year, Zenida discovered she was expecting again. In December 2005, she gave birth to their first child together, a daughter. It was a moment of joy for the young family. 4 years later, in 2009, Zenida gave birth once more, this time to another baby girl. After their wedding and the birth of their daughters, Maurizio began encouraging Zenida to leave her job and dedicate herself fully to raising their children and managing the household. He was firm about his expectations, frequently stating that a real family needed a woman who focused on the home. At the time, his income was steady, and his job in construction offered enough to comfortably support them. Trusting in his promises and eager to provide stability for her daughters, Zenida agreed. She resigned from her position and embraced her new role as a full-time mother and homemaker. The early years of their marriage, especially the initial 3 or 4, were calm and relatively happy. Their lives unfolded in a peaceful rhythm. Zenida created a warm, welcoming home, and her daughters thrived in a structured environment filled with routine and love. They lived in a modest but cozy house in a quiet part of Bergamo. The children attended a well-respected local school known for its safe environment and excellent teachers. On the surface, everything appeared to be going well. During this time, a joyful development brought new hope into Zenida's life. Her younger sister, Oksana, who had remained in Moldova, decided to move to Italy. The sisters had always been extremely close, so Oksana's relocation to Bergamo in the early 2010 felt like a major turning point. With her sister now nearby, Zenida felt less isolated. She finally had someone she could truly talk to, someone who knew her history, her values, and the emotional weight of everything she carried. The two sisters saw each other regularly and supported one another in both practical and emotional ways. However, despite having lived in Italy for several years by that point, Zenida realized she hadn't developed any real friendships beyond her family. It wasn't due to a lack of effort or social opportunity, but rather because of Maurizio. Over time, he had revealed himself to be far more controlling than she initially realized. His warm and generous exterior masked a deeply possessive nature. He closely monitored her conversations, discouraged her from forming new relationships, and subtly restricted her independence in ways that felt suffocating. At first, she excused his behavior. She told herself he was simply passionate and overly protective. When he raised his voice or questioned her whereabouts, she explained it away as a cultural difference, something about fiery tempers and intense emotions. She chalked it up to personality, not a red flag. To friends and acquaintances, she laughed it off. "He's just being a typical Italian," she'd say. But deep down, she felt the strain. It's important to note that during these years, Maurizio never used physical violence. That's one of the key reasons Zenida stayed. To the outside world, and even to herself, she could still justify remaining in the relationship. He hadn't crossed any obvious, unforgivable lines. But what he did resort to was harder to see, yet equally destructive. Emotional manipulation, verbal intimidation, and psychological pressure. He questioned her motives, challenged her independence, and often made her feel as though she owed him everything. Over time, these behaviors chipped away at her self-esteem and sense of freedom. Despite these struggles, he remained a devoted father to their daughters. He attended parent-teacher meetings, helped with homework, and played with the children in the evenings. The girls adored him. To them, he was dad. Present, involved, and caring. That duality made things even more confusing for Zenida. She wanted to preserve the family structure for her children's sake. She kept telling herself that maybe he would change again, that perhaps it was just a phase. As the girls grew older and began school full-time, Zenida's daily routine began to shift. With more free time, she started engaging with other parents, joining the school's parent committee, and even taking Italian language classes to improve her fluency. Slowly, she began to reclaim pieces of her identity. She even started considering a return to part-time work, something flexible that wouldn't interfere with the girls' schedules but could help the family financially and give her a sense of purpose outside the home. However, her renewed independence triggered a sharp change in Maurizio's behavior. He became increasingly agitated, his jealousy growing by the day. Friendly chats with other parents at school became interrogations at home. If Zenida received a phone call, he wanted to know who it was. If she ran errands for too long, he demanded explanations. He developed a habit of scrolling through her phone, checking her messages, reviewing her contact lists, and inspecting her social media accounts. Over time, he even insisted that she cut ties with certain friends unless he personally approved of them. By this point, Maurizio had become a skilled manipulator, knowing exactly how to guilt trip and emotionally destabilize his wife. He played on her vulnerabilities, reminding her that she and the children relied on his income and making her feel incapable of managing on her own. He never needed to raise a hand. His control came through words, tone, and implication. To Zenida, it felt like living in a cage without walls. In private, she began confiding in one of the few friends she had left, someone who had noticed her growing tension and isolation. "I don't feel safe anymore," she whispered during one conversation. "Not physically, he hasn't hurt me, but I'm constantly anxious. I never know what version of him I'll get when he walks through the door." She also shared her growing concerns with her sister Oksana, expressing doubts about the future of her marriage. She talked about the possibility of divorce but feared the consequences. Most of all, she worried that if they separated, Maurizio might try to take custody of the girls. He was their legal father, after all. Meanwhile, Maurizio's personal issues deepened. He had begun drinking more heavily, especially on weekends or after arguments. Under the influence, he often became someone unrecognizable, louder, more confrontational, and completely unwilling to listen. He was no longer the man she had fallen in love with years before. The situation worsened dramatically in late 2018. After a heated dispute with his supervisors, reportedly over a disagreement about workplace policies, Maurizio abruptly quit his longtime job. Rather than reflecting on the incident or trying to find compromise, he blamed everyone else and walked away. He soon took a position at a local pizzeria, but the pattern repeated itself. He clashed with the manager, stirred conflict with coworkers, and eventually left that job as well. With no steady income, the family's financial security collapsed almost overnight. Zenida tried to remain hopeful and supportive, but Maurizio's behavior only deteriorated. Instead of searching for new employment seriously, he cycled through odd jobs while continuing to drink and direct his frustration at home. The pressure on Zenida grew unbearable. By early 2019, Zenida realized she had to act. Their savings were nearly gone, the children's needs were growing, and the environment at home was increasingly unstable. She found a job as a waitress at one of Bergamo's most well-regarded restaurants. Soon after Zenida began working again, a subtle but unmistakable shift began taking place in their household dynamic. For years, Maurizio had been used to having full control over his wife's daily routines, social interactions, and movements. Her decision to rejoin the workforce not only interrupted that pattern, it deeply threatened his sense of dominance and stability. What started as passive resentment quickly spiraled into something far more aggressive and troubling. Already prone to jealousy, Maurizio now became consumed by an irrational fear that he was losing control. The very idea that his wife was spending long hours away from home, interacting with colleagues, patrons, and strangers, triggered emotional tailspins. He would question her relentlessly each evening, launching into lengthy monologues filled with accusations, suspicions, and imaginary scenarios. His interrogations became part of their daily routine. "Who did you talk to today? Why didn't you answer your phone immediately? Why were you smiling in that photo?" Zenida, now shouldering the responsibility of financially supporting her daughters, knew she couldn't afford to give in. Her position at the restaurant was not just a job, it was their family's lifeline. The salary, paired with generous tips, often surpassed what Maurizio had ever managed to earn consistently. This financial shift not only wounded his pride, but fueled a growing hostility that he couldn't contain. Rather than acknowledge her efforts, Maurizio began tearing her down. The emotional temperature at home grew colder with each passing day. At the same time, he abandoned all pretense of job hunting and turned increasingly to alcohol as a means of escape, numbing himself to the reality that his wife was now the pillar of the household. Soon, his possessiveness escalated into surveillance. He demanded constant video calls, regardless of time or place, to prove where she was and who she was with. During her shifts, he would message incessantly, call repeatedly, and insist that she check in with photos or videos. This disruptive behavior began interfering with her duties at the restaurant. Her manager issued a warning, and she faced the very real possibility of losing her job if it continued. To protect her position, Zenida made the difficult decision to turn off her phone during work hours. She hoped that with time, Maurizio would come to accept her new role in the family. But instead of adapting, he unraveled further. Unable to reach her, he grew angrier by the day. Within just 2 weeks, he began appearing unannounced at her workplace. At first, he lingered outside. But as time went on, his confrontations became more overt. He would enter the restaurant during busy hours and demand to speak with her, causing scenes that left both staff and customers deeply uncomfortable. On multiple occasions, he raised his voice and hurled accusations at her in front of everyone. A fellow waitress named Lydia, who had grown close to Zenida, later recalled how she would physically shake when she saw him enter the room. Her whole posture would change, Lydia said. She looked smaller, like she was trying to disappear. Lydia tried to intervene when possible, gently guiding Maurizio outside to calm him down. But his presence alone left a cloud of tension over the workplace. Zenida, who once greeted guests with a warm smile and genuine kindness, now looked perpetually distracted. She flinched at sudden movements or loud noises. Her eyes darted frequently toward the door, as though expecting him to walk in at any moment. With 3 children to support and little to no help from her husband, Zenida secured a second job as a part-time housekeeper at a well-rated local hotel. Though the hours were long and exhausting, she remained determined to provide her daughters with stability and basic comfort. And then, something unexpected happened. She received a modeling offer from a local fashion agency. They were seeking everyday women for a series of lifestyle photo campaigns and saw something unique in Zenida's natural elegance and striking appearance. For the first time in years, she felt seen in a positive light. The offer was professional and paid well. She took on several photo shoots, balancing them between her 2 jobs and her duties at home. Her confidence began to return, but so did Maurizio's rage. Unable to tolerate her success, he sank further into destructive behavior. His drinking became a daily occurrence, and his outbursts escalated from verbal attacks to something darker. Home was no longer a safe haven. It had become a battleground of suspicion, shouting, and relentless criticism. In late July 2019, everything changed. For years, Maurizio's cruelty had been verbal and psychological. But on one sweltering evening, the tension that had been building finally broke. He crossed a boundary that had never been breached before. What began as an argument turned into something far more alarming. That night marked a turning point. What had once been emotional strain now crossed into open aggression. Over the following weeks, this pattern repeated. Zenida, already exhausted from juggling 2 jobs and raising 3 children, now had to navigate an increasingly volatile home life. But despite the fear, she tried to find the right moment to confront the situation head-on. One afternoon, when he was unusually calm and sober, she sat him down for a serious conversation. She explained that the marriage was no longer sustainable, that she wanted a divorce, not out of hatred, but out of necessity. Maurizio did not take it well. He erupted in fury, pacing the room and shouting. He told her he would never let her go, that she belonged to him, and that if she ever tried to leave, there would be serious consequences. His words turned dark, implying that he would rather destroy everything than watch her walk away. It was no longer just jealousy or wounded pride. It was obsession. This time, something inside Zenida snapped. She could no longer dismiss his behavior as passion or cultural temperament. She feared for her safety and for the well-being of her daughters. Trembling, she called the local police and asked for help. When officers arrived, they found her visibly shaken. She explained the situation, outlining her fears, and pleaded for assistance, not in filing charges, but in helping her safely remove herself and her daughters from the house. The officers, while supportive, encouraged her to press charges. They explained that without official documentation, her ability to get legal protection might be limited. But Zenida, ever cautious, declined. She didn't want to escalate the situation further, at least not yet. All she asked was to leave safely, without confrontation. That same day, she packed a few essentials and took her 3 daughters to her sister Oksana's home. Oksana welcomed them without hesitation. There was no judgment, only compassion. Her house became a temporary refuge, offering emotional and physical safety during one of the most terrifying periods of Zenida's life. In the privacy of her sister's kitchen, over cups of tea and muffled sobs, Zenida shared the full truth for the first time. She admitted she no longer felt safe, not just emotionally, but physically. Oksana was heartbroken to hear it. Ironically, she was married to one of Maurizio's cousins, but her own marriage was a stark contrast. Her husband, calm and supportive, had always distanced himself from Maurizio's behavior. Together, they urged Zenida to go to the authorities, to file an official report and seek protection through the legal system. But once again, she hesitated. The following morning began with tense preparation. Zenida knew she had to return to the home she once shared with Maurizio, but not alone. It was no longer just a house. It was a place clouded with dread, unpredictability, and memories that had become too heavy to carry. Her sister's husband, calm but firm in his resolve, offered to accompany her. He was determined to ensure she could gather her belongings without intimidation or disruption, and to stand as a buffer in case another one of Maurizio's unpredictable episodes erupted. As expected, Maurizio was waiting. The moment they stepped through the gate, his face turned stormy. His emotions spiraled immediately into rage. He shouted, pleaded, and demanded that his wife return home. He refused to believe this was truly happening, that Zenida was actually leaving. But this time, there was no room for negotiation. Her mind was made up. Her brother-in-law didn't engage with emotion. Calmly but firmly, he stood between the two and warned Maurizio that if he attempted to block her from leaving or interfered in any way, the police would be called. The authority in his voice had the desired effect. Maurizio, though visibly seething, backed down and stepped aside. He watched silently, jaw clenched, as Zenida packed up essential items, some clothes, documents, and keepsakes for the girls. The home she once kept so carefully now felt cold and unfamiliar. But walking out the door did not mean the nightmare was over. In fact, in many ways, it had just entered its most dangerous phase. It didn't take long for Maurizio to figure out where she had gone. On the evening of October 5th, just before sunset, around 6 p.m., Maurizio appeared outside Oksana's apartment. He was visibly intoxicated, his clothes disheveled, eyes glassy. The apartment complex was located on a quiet residential street, Via Cremona, lined with identical buildings and modest balconies. He rang the doorbell repeatedly, then began shouting, asking to see Zenida. Oksana opened the door just wide enough to speak through the crack. She was calm but firm. She told him he was in no condition to have a civil conversation, and that if he genuinely wanted to talk, he should return when sober, respectful, and clear-minded. She then closed the door, locking it behind her. Maurizio yelled in frustration but eventually retreated, or so it seemed. Instead of leaving the area, he lingered. He began walking aimlessly around the apartment complex, pacing in the dim light, watching from corners, and occasionally peering up at the building's windows. The residents began to notice. His behavior was unsettling, and it wasn't long before Oksana picked up the phone and called the police. She explained the situation in detail, asked for a wellness check, and requested that they investigate the area. Around 11 p.m., a patrol car arrived. The officers scanned the premises, walked around the complex, and even checked the nearby alleyways and courtyards. But by the time they got there, Maurizio was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he had hidden. Perhaps he had driven off temporarily. Either way, nothing suspicious was found, and after about 40 minutes, the officers left. But the tension didn't. Not long after midnight, as Oksana's husband returned from a brief trip to a nearby store, he noticed something off. Parked just a few meters down the street was an older gray Peugeot 207, an all-too-familiar vehicle. It looked almost identical to the one Maurizio used to drive. He mentioned it to Oksana, and together they decided to search the apartment complex grounds once more, this time with flashlights. But despite their efforts, they couldn't find any sign of him. The car seemed empty. The driver was nowhere in sight. Still uneasy, Oksana sent her sister a message. "Please be careful. Let us know the moment you get home. We'll come down and walk with you." But by this point, after so many years of living under stress and constant worry, Zenida had developed a tolerance for fear. It had, sadly, become part of her routine. She replied with a short message. "Don't worry, I'm fine." Then silence. She promised she would call the moment she arrived. But no call ever came. That single missed call would become a moment her loved ones would regret for the rest of their lives. In the early hours of October 6th, around 2 a.m., the silence of the residential night was suddenly interrupted. A sharp noise echoed through the stillness. Startled, Oksana and her husband woke instantly. Their bedroom faced the rear courtyard, so they couldn't immediately see what had caused the commotion. But something deep within Oksana stirred, a mother's instinct, a sister's intuition. She ran from the bedroom to the front window, and what she saw made her blood run cold. She didn't wait for questions. She called her husband, and the two of them rushed downstairs in their pajamas, barefoot and trembling. By the time they reached the front of the building, it was too late. Several neighbors had already gathered, some on their phones with emergency services. Paramedics had been called. In the chaos, it took a moment for Oksana to register what had happened. She knelt beside her, gently holding her hand, whispering for her to stay awake, to stay with them, to keep her eyes open. But the injuries were too severe. By the time medical help arrived, Zenida had already lost consciousness. Within minutes, she was gone. What followed was a whirlwind of heartbreak and urgency. The grief was immediate, but so was the certainty. There was no question about who had done this. Oksana and her husband gave the officers everything they needed: a name, a photo, the make and model of his car, his known habits, and his last known address. A citywide alert was issued within the hour. Surveillance cameras captured footage of a gray Peugeot speeding away from the scene. Using license plate recognition, law enforcement tracked the car leaving Bergamo and heading toward a rural district. Authorities believed the suspect may have parked the car and continued on foot, hoping to hide in nearby wooded or agricultural zones. Roadblocks were quickly set up on highways and exit routes. Helicopters were placed on standby. But despite these efforts, Maurizio managed to evade capture for nearly 20 hours. His plan, however, lacked preparation. He had no supplies, no hideout, and no allies. It was clear he was acting on impulse rather than logic. Eventually, later that evening, October 6th, just past 8 p.m., his attempt to refuel the car at a small suburban gas station led to his arrest. A cashier, recognizing the vehicle from a local alert, discreetly notified police. Officers arrived moments later and took him into custody without incident. At the time of his arrest, Maurizio had sobered up considerably. During initial questioning, he appeared calm, composed, even apologetic. He claimed he could not remember the full events of the previous night, citing alcohol as the cause of his confusion. He told investigators he still loved his wife and insisted he had hoped to reconcile with her. According to him, it had all been a terrible misunderstanding, an accident that spiraled out of control, but investigators weren't convinced. As questioning continued, Maurizio admitted he had followed her. He admitted showing up that night to talk, but when asked about the knife, his story fell apart. He initially claimed he didn't bring any weapon, that he had found one lying on the ground near Oksana's home and picked it up without thinking. But a later search of his home disproved that statement entirely. In the days following the tragedy, investigators meticulously combed through the evidence, determined to reconstruct the exact series of events that led to the harrowing night of October 6th. Surveillance footage, witness statements, forensic data, and digital records allowed law enforcement to piece together the full, chilling picture. The investigation confirmed what prosecutors would later argue in court. This was not a crime born out of a spontaneous outburst. The premeditation was clear. The legal proceedings began in December 2019, less than 3 months after the crime that had shocked the community. He admitted to feeling regret, but stopped short of accepting full responsibility. Maurizio was facing a possible life sentence for the charges brought against him. The legal team on both sides braced for a lengthy trial. But before the proceedings could conclude, a startling and abrupt development brought the entire process to a standstill. One morning, just days before the final stage of sentencing, Prison staff found Maurizio unresponsive in his cell. Despite immediate efforts by medical personnel, he was pronounced dead at the scene. The justice system would never deliver its final verdict.